Gauntlet and the Corrupted Gauntlet are both very difficult to learn, but I'll show you some great tactics, the best plugins to use, and how to avoid certain boss mechanics that make this so much easier. First though, it can be accessed in the northwest of Prifddinas through this portal after you've completed the Song of the Elves quest, which does require you to have a lot of level 70 stats. But other than that requirement, there's nothing else, and you don't need any gear at all or weapons because you make them within the instance. However, that being said, the Gauntlet is very unforgiving if you make any mistakes, and the higher your combat levels are in all styles, the easier it's going to be for you. So I personally recommend that you have at least level 80 in magic, range and your melee stats for the normal Gauntlet, and level 90 in the same stats for the Corrupted Gauntlet, which will make learning it so much less frustrating. So the Gauntlet is a randomly generated dungeon with multiple rooms that are always in a 7x7 layout. The boss is always in the very centre, and 1 square away in any direction is the resource area where you can cook food and create things from the material that you gathered. Within the dungeon are 6 mini bosses that only have 1 attack style each, 2 dragons that attack with magic, 2 dark beasts that attack with range, and 2 bears that attack with melee. These drop a component that could be used to upgrade a weapon that uses the same combat style as the bosses themselves into the highest possible tier weapon that you can get within the dungeon. The mini bosses are always in these squares, but again randomly, and if you happen to kill 2 of the same mini boss, the second time it's going to drop an upgrade for a different weapon instead. I want to specifically mention this because this upgrade is by far the most important in the dungeon, and because the boss changes its prayers every 6 attacks that you do based on what weapon you're using, you ideally want 2 of these. So you start off in the dungeon with a crystal axe, which can be used to chop friend roots for some bark that is then used to create armor. Crystal pickaxe that is used to mine ore, also used for armor. Crystal harpoon to catch paddlefish, which you can then cook on the range in the starter area, and these heal you for 20, plus a pestle and mortar that you can use crystal shards on, which are things that you receive from various activities in the dungeon, and once you've ground them down, these are a secondary ingredient for the potions that you make, plus you get a crystal teleport that teleports you back to the start. Initially, all rooms apart from the starter room and the boss room are in darkness, and you've got a scepter equipped which acts as a basic melee weapon, but it's also used to light up new rooms that you haven't explored yet, and you do that by clicking either edge of the entrance to that room. In the corner of the starting resource area is also a singing bowl that can be used to create more teleports, some vials to make potions, plus armor and weapons. Now that's probably a lot to take in, but I'll be going through each part as we need it in more detail. So to create armor within the dungeon, there are 3 resources that you need to gather. Friend roots, which you get from cutting trees, ore, which you get from mining rocks, and linen that you get from picking these. And every piece of armor that you create or upgrade to a higher tier, you need the exact same amount of resources each time. So for example, to make a tier 1 helm, body and legs, you need 3 bark, 3 ore, and 3 linen, plus 40 shards for each piece that you create. You'll automatically get shards as you go around because you can occasionally get them when gathering any resources, and you get them as well when killing creatures in the dungeon. But sometimes you have to go out your way to kill more creatures to get a few more if you're low. To upgrade from tier 1 armor to tier 2 armor requires 1 of each resource to upgrade both the legs and the helmet, but you need 2 of each to upgrade the body, plus another 60 shards for each piece. And finally, to upgrade to the highest tier, tier 3, requires 2 of each resource for every single piece and another 80 shards. Now armor is very important. Not only does it increase your defense as usual, but it also increases your accuracy in all combat styles. It gives you a prayer bonus, and it reduces the amount of damage you take from all creatures by a significant amount. T3 armor, for example, reduces all damage taken by half compared to not wearing any armor at all. For the weapons, to create your first one, the first thing you need to do is to find a room with creatures in it, and killing them will give you a chance to get a weapon frame, and that is guaranteed by your 3rd kill of any of the smaller creatures like the rats, and guaranteed on your first kill on the high level creatures like the scorpion and the unicorns. You can then take it back to the singing bowl with 20 crystals and select 6 for a spear, 7 for a staff, or 8 for a bow. And if you have 80 shards instead of 20, you can press that number twice and you receive the T2 version instead of the T1. To then upgrade that weapon to T3, which is the highest tier that we have in this dungeon, you need to kill any of the mini bosses as mentioned earlier, and then come back to the singing bowl and press the correct number. You don't need anything else for the upgrade to T3 other than that item, not even shards. In the dungeon are also some grime or grim roots, which give you a herb. You can then buy a vial from the singing bowl for 10 shards, which you can fill up with water either from the pump in the opposite corner or from any of the fishing spots. Then you can add the herb and use 10 shards on your pestle and mortar and add it into the potion to create a potion that acts as both a stamina and a prayer potion at the same time. Now there's so much going on in the dungeon, it's quite difficult sometimes to remember all of the resources you've gathered, what you're going to need, how many herbs you have, let alone to keep count of how many shards you need. So a very useful plugin is simply called the Gauntlet. And once you've installed that, first tick the box that says track resources and then enter how much of each resource that you want to gather. You'll need less the more practice that you get, but initially start out by entering 13 in the ore, bark and linen sections, which is enough to get you every single piece of T3 armor, 2 grime leaves, 2 weapon frames, 20 paddlefish and 740 shards. Now you might not even get all of that, but you want to aim to get the best items when learning it, and if you end up with one piece of armor that's T2 or something that's not slightly as good, you're still going to have a good chance of killing the boss. Next on the plugin, select Resource Overlay and make sure each box is ticked. This is going to highlight every resource until you have enough to make it far easier to find them. Then under Utilities, tick the box that says Prevent Entry with Uncooked Fish, and this stops you entering the boss room if you forgot to cook your fish. Trust me, we've all done it. Then under NPCs, tick Highlight Demi-Bosses, and similar to resources, it just makes it easy to find them if you decide to go back to them later. And then the last one is optional, but under Hunleff tab, which is the boss, you can choose to outline its area so it's easy to see, because standing under this boss can result in you getting stomped for a lot of damage, similar to the Corporal Beast. Once you've done that, the plugin will show you all of the resources in the top left of the corner that you still need to gather so you know exactly where you are at any point in the dungeon. So this is the strategy I find the easiest to use when starting out in the Gauntlet. Start out by opening the rooms one square away from the starting area and gather all of the items you can except for fish, which you want to do last, and kill any creatures you find until you get a weapon frame and then ignore them after that just for now. The amount of resources you need for all of those weapons and items is going to be enough to fill up 3 inventories, so it's important you don't go too far from the start initially and save your 1 teleport crystal for later, as buying more teleports means you need even more shards, so try to avoid that if you can. So the goal at the start is to simply fill up your inventory with the items that you need, then go to the singing bowl and ideally create yourself a T2 weapon very quickly. And then if you have some shards left over, buy yourself 2 vials and make any armor that you can with the resources that you gathered so far. Whatever resources you have left in your inventory after that point, simply drop them to the floor next to the singing bowl to be used for later. Now you can speed up the dropping part of this by going into the settings, then all settings and then controls, and go down a little bit to where it says shift click to drop all items and then tick the box. That means anytime you hold down the shift button, you can click on anything in your inventory and it'll drop it to the floor. So after you've got your T2 weapon and just your starter items in your inventory, you now want to head to the outside areas where the mini bosses are, gathering any resources on the way that you still need apart from fish. Plus this time, if you see any wolves, unicorns or scorpions, kill them for the shards as they usually drop quite a lot. In a typical dungeon, you're going to need to kill about 3 of these per dungeon to get all of the shards that you're going to need for full T3 armor, although it is RNG based and it can vary. Also pick any grime leaves on the way too and make potions if you can, and once you've crushed 2 lots of shards, you can drop the pestle and mortar, it isn't needed for anything else in the dungeon. In a similar way, once you've cut all the bark you need, you can drop the axe, and when you've mined all 13 ores, you can drop the pickaxe too. Once you get to the outside edge, keep going around all of the outside rooms until you reach a mini-boss, kill it and pick up all of the items that you want, including the weapon frame and the unique, which is a bowstring from the Dark Beast, an orb from the dragon, or a spike from the bear. Again, these are used to upgrade the T2 weapon to a T3 one and don't require any shards to make. Before teleporting back to the start, make sure to get yourself 2 uniques and a full inventory of items, and then head back to base. At this point, create your 2 T3 weapons if possible, buy a crystal teleport shard, make any other items that you can, and again drop any resources that you can't use yet. Now at this point you should really just need fish plus any resources that you've been really unlucky with, typically it's normally only 1, to go out for a final time and get the items that you need, and 20 fish, whilst again killing creatures if you still need some shards, and then teleport home to make your final gear. Eventually, you're just not going to need this many resources as you get better at the boss and make less mistakes. The dungeon becomes much quicker. But initially, honestly, just play it safe because this boss can become very frustrating very quickly if you don't have good weapons and gear. Make the last of your gear, cook your fish, and you should now have 2 potions, be wearing full T3 or pretty much, have 2 T2 weapons plus 20 fish, or at least close to that, which is fine, and you can now enter the boss room, or if your time runs out in the dungeon, you're automatically teleported to the boss anyway. For the boss, there's a lot of mechanics that individually are pretty simple on their own, but they can overlap each other, and deaths of this boss are almost always when 2 or 3 of them happen at the same time. The first mechanic is on the ground will occasionally be an area of blue tiles, that after a short while will then turn light brown. If you stand on these tiles, once they go light brown, they're going to do between 10 and 20 damage every single tick, which is every 0.6 seconds. Next, the boss will also switch its attacks itself every 4 attacks. It can only attack with magic and range and switches between the two, and it always starts the fight with range. When attacking with magic, it can also disable your prayers, and it's highly recommended you have sound on for this boss as it has a lot of audio clues. This is the sound it makes when the attack is about to disable your prayers. This is also the noise it makes when it has one more attack before it's going to change its attack style, and it then does this noise afterwards to tell you that it has actually changed its combat style. So it warns you like this, which means there's one attack left. It then attacks you, and then it makes this noise to make sure you know it is now switched. Although the boss only attacks with magic and range, if you run under the boss, similar to the Court Beast, it can also stomp you for up to 68 damage. And all of those mechanics mean that it takes a while to learn, but it doesn't take that long before it comes second nature, and when you have T3 armor, it reduces so much of the damage when you inevitably make some mistakes. The main mechanic that will kill you though is periodically, about every 3 switches between attack styles the boss does, it will stomp on the ground and summon some tornadoes. The lower its health, the more it will spawn, and in the normal Gauntlet it can spawn up to 3, and in the corrupted Gauntlet it can spawn up to 4. What these do is they follow you around the room, and if they reach you, they can do up to 30 damage per tick. However, with T3 armor, that is reduced to 15. But even still, running into 3 of them can deal up to 45 damage every 0.6 seconds, so avoiding these at all costs is probably the most important thing in the fight. The movement, though, is very predictable, and doing the following makes it so much easier. Firstly, whilst you're learning the boss, always make sure you're high health at any time. Between this and your T3 armor alone means that you're going to survive most mistakes. For the tornadoes specifically, the best defense, and the reason I have this awful overhead view at this boss, is because running from corner to corner is the safest way to deal with them. The reason they are so dangerous is not just because of the damage they do, but because whilst you're running away from them, the boss can change attack styles, it can disable your prayers, the floor can change colours, blocking the way you intended to go, and when you have to deal with 2 or 3 things in a split second, you're essentially going to die if you're not quick enough. But by running a large distance from one side to the other, you avoid the thing most likely to kill you for long periods at a time, which is the tornadoes. And if something else happens when you're running from one side of the room to the other, you've got plenty of time to react because the tornadoes are irrelevant at that point and it's not as devastating. There's a lot of other ways to avoid them too, as the floor changing colour means that's not always possible. So firstly, they don't react until you have reached a new tile. That means, for example, if you click here, in the next tick they're still moving towards you whilst you're moving the other way, making it very easy to sidestep them. So if you need to double back on yourself and they're coming towards you, all you have to do is move a few tiles to one side and then back the way you came, which will always avoid them without taking any damage. You can also use the natural pathing in old school RuneScape, where a character will always run diagonally last in an open area like this. So in this layout, for example, which is one of the hardest ones in the Corrupted Gauntlet, it looks like you got very little room to maneuver, but if you're here, clicking on this tile will never take you across the brown tiles, and you'll take this path, naturally sidestepping them in the process. In the same way, if you are instead over here, you'll take this path, and so on. Essentially meaning no matter where you are in this area here, clicking on this tile will path you safely to the corner, avoiding all of the floor mechanics. Then you can sidestep them and click back on this corner here, and it will do the same on the way back, avoiding all of the tornadoes that followed you. This is again a long pathing distance, so any change of prayer the boss does, disabling of your prayers, and so on, you have time to react without worrying about the tornadoes. When starting out, I also recommend not attacking the boss in this phase just until you're used to it. Trying to get an extra attack here whilst learning the boss is highly likely to get yourself killed. Finally, the last way to avoid the tornadoes, and I only recommend this one if you're very comfortable doing so, The tornadoes essentially move at walking pace, and when you run in old school, how the game works is it ignores the tile in the middle between where you started running and where you end up one tick later, and that also includes avoiding any mechanics within it. So when the tornadoes are 2 tiles away from you, you can essentially run through them if you click at this point. What happens is on the next tick, the tornadoes move 1 tile closer to where you just were, whilst you run to the other side of them, avoiding all damage and completely missing each other. If you get this wrong though, especially if there's a stack of them, you are going to take a lot of damage. For the position that you want to try and always be in before the tornadoes are up, I recommend staying in line with any of the exits. Since the tornadoes spawn near any of the corners, standing in the middle between any 2 corners will give you a little bit more reaction time once they spawn. After that, for the normal Gauntlet, it really is just a lot of practice, and honestly don't give up if you die a lot initially, it happens to us all, it is just a very difficult boss to learn initially. The Corrupted Gauntlet is almost identical, but you have less time for the dungeon part, meaning realistically you want to aim at getting 2 T3 weapons and T2 armor, possibly 1 piece of T3 if you can manage it when you're first learning it. The boss has more health, better stats, does more damage, and summons 4 tornadoes in the last part. However, in the last quarter of the boss's health, these 2 tiles 3 squares away from any door will never turn light brown, making them completely safe in that phase. For the combat achievements on the normal Gauntlet, a lot of these simply require a lot of practice to perfect it, but I have some tips that can help with a few of them. For 3-2-1 range, make sure you've got your sound on. We now get 2 prompts before the boss changes attack styles, so this achievement shouldn't be too difficult with a little bit of practice. Defense doesn't matter, make sure to get 2 T3 weapons and a full inventory of paddlefish. If you can try to only eat up to full health whilst avoiding the tornadoes at the same time, that's going to give you the most uptime for that combat achievement. The damage you take without armor though is significant, and you're going to quickly go through your food on this one. Wolf Puncher means you can only make 1 T3 weapon as well as T1 weapons. However, with T3 armor, that's going to be absolutely fine once you get decent at killing the boss. However, if you have all 3 different styles of weapon, so for example your scepter as a melee weapon, a T3 bow and a T1 staff, what you can do is, since the boss changes prayers every 6 attacks, it changes on the 6th attack to whatever weapon you use on that attack. So you can attack with your T3 bow for 5 attacks, then switch to whatever weapon the boss isn't praying against, and Hunleff will then protect from that combat style, allowing you to switch back to your T3 bow for another 5 attacks and then do the same again. Counting the attacks does take a little bit of practice though and can be quite distracting, so only do that if you're comfortable. If not, just use a T3 weapon and a T1 weapon and you'll be absolutely fine. Crystalline Warrior you'll do naturally anyway if you follow this guide, but to make sure you get enough resources, the best thing you can do is to open as many areas as possible. So anytime you're running past an entrance, open it up anyway, even if you don't intend to go that way, and later if you're missing one type of resources, which is normally how you fail this one, it makes it so much easier. Now, perfect Crystalline Hunleff does require a ton of practice. Essentially, you can't make a single mistake or attack the boss with any combat style that it's praying against. And the only real advice I can give you is a small one, and that's just to turn auto retaliate off. There's nothing worse than failing this challenge, because whilst you avoid another mechanic, you automatically retaliated as the boss switch prayers. Egg Diet is very easy on the normal Gauntlet if you just use protection prayers and don't use piety or so on. With a high prayer level, you won't run out of prayer doing this. The kill is a bit longer, but this one is pretty simple and you don't even need to prayerfully. The hardest challenge by far is Gauntlet speedrunner. In fact, less people have done this than the Corrupted Gauntlet version of it, and the worst part about the speedruns in this is just how much RNG is needed, but this is the tactic that I used. Start off outside the instance on Lunas and cast Vengeance, it could make the difference, and since we start between 2 rooms, quickly open them, and if there are creatures to kill them for a weapon frame. If not, simply leave the dungeon and start again. After you've got your weapon frame, if there's any pools to fish in nearby, do that as you can get shards from them, because if you can get enough shards to create a T2 weapon instead of a T1, it's going to save you so much time at the mini boss. So now with your weapon, you want to head to the closest edge, which is always in the opposite direction to the boss when you're in the starter room, and here's a map so you can see that a little bit more easily. And of course you want to fish any pools you find on the way, and I would say you need at least 8 fish and no more than 12 to do this, plus a herb to make a potion. Now of course if you get 8 fish you're more likely to die at the boss, but you save a little bit of time, whereas if you get 12 fish you're using a little bit extra time that you might need later, so it's really just a balancing act, but between 8 and 12 is generally about the sweet spot. Next, open these 3 rooms, and if you find a dragon or a dark beast, kill it for one of the T3 weapon parts and pick up the weapon frame too. Unfortunately, if there's not one in these 3 rooms, you have to reset the dungeon as you're not going to have enough time to complete this challenge. If you do get one though, home tally and make yourself a T3 weapon, and if the T3 weapon is range, make a T1 staff too, whereas if the T3 weapon is mage, make a T1 bow. Then make a potion, cook your fish and head into the boss, making sure you got your 2 weapons, a scepter for a melee weapon, your food and your potion. Now, if during the prep you don't get enough shards, you have to start again. If there isn't a herb, you have to start again. If there isn't a dog beast or a dragon, as I said before, well, you get the point. You're only going to get the perfect setup about 1 in 5 runs, but if you go too far the opposite way and you spend more time opening more rooms to try and get the items you need, you'll be able to complete the dungeon, but you'll run out of time, unless you get some absolutely insane RNG. And even with the perfect setup, it's going to take an average about 10 tries without any mistakes, where you don't run out of food and you do enough damage to kill a boss, where you're going to complete this challenge. And this is probably one of the hardest challenges that I've done so far. For the Corrupted Gauntlet challenge 3-2-1 mage, again just leave the sound on, and with practice you're going to get this at some point without even trying. Defense doesn't matter too, is quite rough. You need to get 2 T3 weapons, 2 potions and a full inventory of foods realistically to be able to complete this one. And even if you don't make any mistakes at all, you'll probably run out of food a lot of the time, and I would only attempt this challenge once you can kill Corrupted Hunleff without any mistakes at all. You will usually have a couple of doses of potions spare, and if you can use a redemption near the end when you run out of food, that can really help with this challenge and it can make it a little bit easier. But mainly, you need to run with a lot of luck to be able to do it, where you hit like a beast or you take a lot less damage than usual. Corrupted Warrior with a time limit of 7.5 minutes makes it difficult to get so many resources in that time, but you don't need T3 weapons, so prioritize armor and again open absolutely every room you can when you're running past them. Typically, you fail this more often than not by running around looking for the last item that you need, or you don't get enough shards, so kill the high level creatures when you can as well. Regniel died too, you're going to need to flick prayer for this one. However, you don't have to be perfect when doing it. You can be overly cautious and leave your overhead prayers on for 2 ticks each attack, and as long as you're not using piety or any similar different prayers, you'll have enough prayers without potions to easily kill a boss. So just make sure to get some good armor and weapons, and this one's pretty simple. Wolf Puncher 2 is exactly the same as Wolf Puncher. The easiest way to do it is to create 1 T3 weapon and 2 T1 weapons, making sure to have 1 in each combat style, and again you can use the scepter as a melee weapon instead if you want. You then need to count every 5 attacks you do against the boss, then equip the T1 weapon or the scepter that the boss isn't praying against and attack it with that once, which will make the boss pray against that weapon, allowing you to use your T3 weapon again for another 5 attacks. Perfect the Corrupted Hunleff is again simply practice and turn auto retaliate off so you don't accidentally fail this challenge. The hardest one again is the speed one, Corrupted Gauntlet Speedrunner. For this, I use Vengeance before entering. It sounds trivial, but as someone who has failed this challenge by 1 second and then took another 50 or so tries to do it, it could make all of the difference. Then open the 3 nearest rooms to you at the start and path around like this. And the most important thing to get in these 3 rooms is a weapon frame and 80 shards for a T2 weapon. But we also need at some point in the dungeon 12 fish, 1 herb and 3 of each resource to make T1 armor. If after you've opened all 3 rooms you don't have 80 shards and a weapon frame, simply start again and don't waste any more time on the dungeon. But if you do, make a T2 bow or staff, whichever one you prefer, whichever you got the highest stats in, and if you have any spare shards, get yourself a vial and any armor that you can make currently. Next, head to the only room you haven't opened next to the starter area, and then head towards where the mini bosses are, gathering any resources that you still need on the way. If at the end in any of the 3 rooms that contain a mini boss there is a dragon or a dark beast, kill it for the T3 piece and the weapon frame, if not reset the dungeon. However, if there is one, whilst killing it, open the rooms next to it at the same time so you're not losing any time at all. And at this point, if in all the rooms that you've opened so far there's not enough resources including shards to create yourself full T1 armor, a T3 weapon, a T1 weapon, potion, and at least 8 fish, ideally 12, then again you need to reset the dungeon. If there is though, you can kill the boss, and if by chance there's also another mini boss that you've uncovered, I would personally kill it and have 2 T3 weapons. You do lose more time at this part, but then you spend less time at the boss. There's not much difference between the two, but I just think by having 2 T3 weapons it makes the boss easier. But if you have just 1 T3 weapon, make sure you create the T3 weapon that needed to complete the combat triangle, with the scepter being the melee weapon. With just one T3 weapon, you need to do the count again to every 5 attacks, and then change your weapon for the 6th attack to make the boss pray against it. Again, you can then change back to the T3 weapon and attack another 5 times before doing the same again. Now, if you're not confident in doing that without a mistake, I would simply keep doing the dungeon until you get 2 T3 weapons. It will take the challenge longer, but it's not that uncommon. The challenge itself is all about RNG, luck, and not making a single mistake. Even then, I think it took me around 100 attempts to do this challenge, and then when I finally did it, absolutely everything went right, typically, and I beat it by 22 seconds. There really is just a ton of luck involved. So that is hopefully everything that you need to know, and if there's anything I missed or anything that you're not sure of, just ask in the comments and I'll message you back as soon as I'm on.